June 6th, Utah Beach. The sand was a thick gray mist as the first light of dawn crept over the beach. The deafening roar of waves crashing against the shore was drowned out by the shriek of artillery and the crackle of machine gun fire. The air smelled of salt and smoke, a pungent mix that clung to everything's skin, equipment, the damp, blood-stained sand. American soldiers, their faces a mixture of grim determination and terror, surged forward under a sky full of bursting shells and tracer rounds. They had come to fight for something greater than themselves, yet they were still human, feeling the raw terror of an enemy that wanted nothing more than to see them fall. In the distance, scattered groups of German soldiers peered through the smoke, their hands shaking as they clutched rifles and machine guns, watching the approaching force. They had been prepared for a landing, but nothing had quite prepared them for what was coming. The sheer scale of the invasion, the sound, the chaos, the impossibility of it was overwhelming. And that was before they even knew about the logistics nightmare waiting for them on the ground. Among these German soldiers, Oberstleutnant Franz Weber stood in a shallow trench, his back pressed against the cool earth, staring through a pair of binoculars. His mind, sharp but burdened by the toll of months spent in the trenches, struggled to keep up with the fast-moving situation. He could see the relentless tide of American forces pushing forward, but what struck him most wasn't the number of men on the beach or the storm of gunfire. No, it was the supply ships, the trucks, the constant reinforcements that seemed to pour in like a river with no end. Every time a German soldier fired a round, it felt like a grain of sand in the desert. "What is happening?" Weber muttered to himself as he lowered his binoculars. His hands trembled not from fear, but from a dawning realization this was unlike anything the German army had faced before. There were far too many of them. Too many men. Too much equipment. "Are we sure this is all they've brought?" He barked to his subordinate, a young corporal named Eric, whose wide eyes betrayed the confusion in his mind. "Yes, sir," Eric replied, voice tight with disbelief. "More are coming, sir. I saw them unloading all night. There are trucks, tanks, it's endless, Herr Oberstleutnant." Weber stood silently, feeling the weight of the situation press on him. Back home in Germany, the propaganda had made the Allies seem like a fragile coalition, incapable of sustaining the fight. The Reich had mocked the Allied forces' inferiority, believing them to be weak, uncoordinated. But on that beach, nothing could be further from the truth. The Allies, specifically the Americans, were not only winning the battle but were doing so with a relentless, terrifying speed that no one had anticipated. And it wasn't just the number of troops that stunned Weber and his men. It was the flow of resources, the endless streams of supplies, ammunition, food, tanks, vehicles, and medical aid all pouring into the front lines. In an age where logistics were as critical as combat, the Americans had achieved something almost impossible. With every new wave, it became clear they could out-supply, outlast, and out-fight the Germans, no matter how entrenched they were. The stark contrast between the Allied capabilities and the strained German supply lines was never more apparent than it was that first morning of D-Day. By noon, the situation on the beaches had shifted. The landings were far from perfect, but they were relentless. While Weber's division was still scrambling to hold its position, German commanders across Normandy were receiving reports that seemed impossible. The Americans weren't just landing, they were building, expanding, and digging in. While German positions were reinforced with what they could muster from their own overstretched reserves, the Allies were already creating their own supply network from scratch. "Continue," Weber muttered to himself, trying to focus as he adjusted his binoculars once more, watching the advancing American forces. "We can't stop them." But deep down, he knew. The logistics game was lost. This was no longer a battle that could be won by sheer force alone. What the Germans had never fully grasped was how America's industrial power had outpaced even the most optimistic German expectations. The reinforcements and supplies that seemed to flow endlessly across the English Channel were part of a machine that the German army simply couldn't compete with. June 7th, 1944. 8 a.m., Headquarters, German Command Post, Normandy. The sun rose higher over the French countryside, but it did little to warm the cold dread creeping through the cramped, dimly lit command post. The air inside smelled faintly of damp paper and stale coffee. Oberstleutnant Weber, his uniform still covered in the grime of battle, stood in front of a large map of Normandy. Red pins marked German positions, blue pins indicated where the Allies had broken through. But what had caught his attention, what had made his heart sink, was the flow of incoming reports. The Germans had anticipated a fierce Allied attack on the beaches. What they hadn't prepared for was the scale of the resupply effort that followed. American trucks, lorries, and armored vehicles, every possible form of transport, were flooding into the region at an overwhelming rate. From the skies came parachutes bearing everything from ammunition to medical supplies. Even the seas, teeming with landing craft and supply ships, couldn't be contained. It was as if every one of their ships, from the smallest fishing boats to colossal Liberty ships, was part of a vast, unstoppable army of logistics. Unbelievable, Weber muttered, tracing the lines of supply routes with his finger. This is more than we can handle. At the center of the command post, General Heinrich von der Heide paced back and forth, his boots tapping harshly against the wooden floor. "What's the problem, Weber?" he snapped, frustration boiling over. "We knew they were coming. We knew there would be a landing. Why are we still caught flat-footed?" Weber's mind raced. It wasn't just the overwhelming numbers of soldiers or the constant bombardment from Allied warships. It was the infrastructure, the sheer ability of the American forces to keep their men equipped, supplied, and moving forward, even when the Germans tried to push them back. The Allies were always just a step ahead, always replenishing their losses as quickly as they sustained them. "We underestimated their capacity for sustained supply," Weber finally said, his voice low. "The Allies. They don't just fight with their weapons and men. They fight with an endless tide of ammunition, vehicles, fuel. They're turning Normandy into an industrial war zone, General." Von der Heide paused, staring at the map, and for the first time, the weight of reality seemed to settle in. The Germans were already stretched thin across multiple fronts. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets were pushing forward with unstoppable force, while in Italy, the Allies were advancing slowly but steadily. Now, in Normandy, the Americans were doing the same but with a resilience that was wearing down the German defenses. Weber continued, his voice gaining strength. "Their trucks, their tanks, they keep coming, faster than we can deal with them, and every time we destroy one, another takes its place. You should see the way they're unloading the ships, tanks, jeeps, machine guns, and more. They've already moved past the beachhead and are setting up supply depots deep inland." Von der Heide's face darkened. "And what of our reserves? We have to stop them." "We can't," Weber replied bluntly. "They're feeding the front lines with more supplies than we can intercept. And it's not just weapons. It's food. It's medicine. It's morale." In the months leading up to D-Day, the Germans had been banking on the assumption that the Allies would not be able to sustain an invasion on such a massive scale. They believed the Allies' supply chains would buckle under the pressure of continuous warfare, but they had underestimated one critical factor: America's industrial might, its ability to produce and deliver weapons and supplies faster than any other nation in the war. America was fighting not just with soldiers, but with an unstoppable industrial juggernaut. The United States had harnessed its massive manufacturing capacity to produce tanks, aircraft, trucks, and munitions at an astounding rate. Every factory, every dockyard, every shipyard had been converted to war production. And now, in Normandy, that effort was bearing fruit in ways the Germans couldn't have predicted. "Can't we block their supply routes?" Von der Heide asked, still hopeful. "We've tried," Weber said, shaking his head. "But it's not enough. Their air superiority ensures that any attempt to strike at their supply lines is met with swift retaliation. In their logistical network, it's too dispersed. Too many channels, too many ways to get supplies to the front." As Weber spoke, an officer entered the room with a report, handed it to von der Heide, and stepped back. Von der Heide skimmed the paper quickly, then crumpled it in his fist. This can't be possible." "What is it, General?" Weber asked, his voice strained with impatience. "Another report," von der Heide growled. "A convoy of trucks carrying more fuel just passed through their lines. On its way to the front, and we couldn't touch it." Weber exhaled slowly, the truth sinking in. "It's over. If they can sustain this, then we're done." Von der Heide finished, a bitter edge to his words. "This war isn't about winning battles anymore. It's about who can keep fighting. And it looks like they have the upper hand." June 8, 1944, 4 p.m. German command post, Normandy. The weather had turned for the worse. Thick clouds blanketed the sky, and a cold rain began to fall over the battlefield, turning the ground into a sticky, treacherous mud. In the distance, the rumble of American artillery could be heard, the thunderous cracks of shells shaking the earth. Inside the German command post, the mood was one of exhaustion, both physical and mental. Oberstleutnant Weber sat at a desk, his face drawn with fatigue. His uniform was soaked, and his helmet had been discarded, the insignia on it worn and faded from days of relentless battle. His eyes scanned over more reports, all of which told the same story: the Allies were everywhere. With every passing hour, the situation grew direr. The beachheads had expanded, and now, Allied forces were pushing inland at a pace that seemed impossible. New American tanks Shermans, which Weber had first written off as unreliable, were now rolling through the countryside with surprising speed and efficiency. He had seen them for himself in the past few days, unstoppable, backed by a network of supplies that allowed them to keep coming no matter how many were destroyed. These weren't isolated incidents, this was the new reality. Waves upon waves of Allied forces, armed to the teeth, coming from a never-ending stream of supply lines. "How long can we keep this up?" muttered Lieutenant Schwarz, one of Weber's trusted subordinates. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. "We're running out of everything. Fuel, men, food, even our morale is slipping." Weber looked out the window, where the rain now fell in sheets, blurring the line between sky and earth. "We can hold for a while," he replied quietly. But only for a while. A sudden noise interrupted their conversation. The thump of a distant explosion, followed by a rattle of machine gun fire. The air was thick with tension. The Germans had been pushed back from their initial positions on the beaches, and now they were fighting an uphill battle to regain some ground. But it was more than just fighting, it was survival. The reality was sinking in for everyone now. The German army, once a proud and powerful force, was stretched thin, fighting battles on both the eastern and western fronts. The logistics of war were no longer on their side. Where once they had relied on a swift, efficient supply chain, they were now struggling to make do with what little they had left. The Americans, on the other hand, had built their own war machine, a machine that ran on an endless supply of fuel, ammunition, and food. It was a brutal reminder of what industrial power could do in a total war. Weber stood, stretching his stiff legs. He couldn't focus on the reports anymore. He had seen the numbers, heard the whispers from the front. The Allies were not only fighting with superior numbers and firepower, they were fighting with an unrelenting rhythm, as if the supply train would never stop. The Americans had turned Normandy into a living, breathing logistical hub, a place where every available resource was poured into maintaining their offensive. It was this relentless flow that had stunned the German officers. The sheer volume of incoming supplies had begun to break their will. Unlike the Germans, who were facing fuel shortages, diminishing supplies, and an overstretched railway system, the Allies had the world's most powerful industrial base at their back. While the German Wehrmacht was grinding to a halt, the Americans were simply getting stronger with each passing hour. "How are we supposed to stop them?" Lieutenant Schwarz asked, his voice edged with desperation. "There are too many of them." Weber's eyes darkened. "We can't stop them. Not the way we used to." A silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. There was no strategy left, no secret weapon to turn the tide. The Luftwaffe had been decimated, and without air superiority, any hope of disrupting the American supply lines was a distant dream. Even the vaunted German tank divisions like the Panzer IVs and Tigers were being overwhelmed by the American Sherman tanks, which, despite their technical shortcomings, were proving to be more than a match when coupled with superior logistics and mass production. The Germans had long prided themselves on their speed and tactical flexibility. But now, in the wake of D-Day, it was becoming painfully clear that speed no longer mattered. The Allies had taken the first step toward winning the war through sheer logistical might, and that would not be easy to overcome. No amount of bravery, no number of heroic last stands, could undo the mountain of supplies fueling the American advance. Weber rubbed his eyes. He was tired of reading reports. He needed action. "Lieutenant Schwarz, get me a report from the front lines. I want to know the exact location of their supply depots." The lieutenant nodded quickly, moving to relay the order, but Weber already knew the answer. The supply depots were everywhere, hidden in forests, behind hills, even along the roadways. The Allies had perfected a system of resupply that was as much a part of their military strategy as any tank or artillery piece. The movement of these supplies had already outpaced the Germans' ability to intercept them. Weber could already hear the growing sound of American tanks approaching in the distance. The assault was coming once more. June 9, 1944. 11 a.m. German command post, Normandy. The skies above Normandy had cleared, but the weight of the situation in the German command post only seemed to grow heavier. The constant bombardment from Allied artillery had left the walls and ceilings vibrating with every new blast, and yet the Germans inside remained still locked in place by a shared understanding. They were losing. There was no denying it now. The American logistical machine, a force that seemed to have no end, was proving far too much for them to handle. Oberstleutnant Weber sat at the edge of the long wooden table, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed the latest communications from the front. A brief flicker of hope had briefly emerged when a small contingent of German reinforcements newly arrived from the southern sector attempted a counterattack against the advancing Americans. But that hope was quickly dashed as reports came in. The Allied forces had already received fresh supplies of ammunition, fuel, and men. The counterattack had been crushed before it could gain any meaningful ground. The flood of supplies, coming from the British and American ports, seemed to have no end. Even as the Germans attacked, the Allies simply replenished their resources. Fresh convoys arrived every day, as regular as clockwork. The supply lines ran like veins throughout the region, constantly moving forward, never retreating. What is the point? Lieutenant Schwartz's voice was low, almost a whisper, as he looked up from his own report. No matter what we do, they keep coming. Weber looked over at his young subordinate, a man who had once been full of confidence and pride. Now, he appeared drained, his face pale and gaunt from days of stress and exhaustion. We do what we can, Lieutenant, Weber replied. But we can't win this battle the way we thought we could. As much as Weber had tried to keep the situation under control, it was becoming impossible to ignore the mounting pressure. The Germans had always prided themselves on their ability to move fast on the blitzkrieg tactics that had taken Europe by storm. But now, those same tactics felt like an ancient relic. The American strategy wasn't about speed, it was about sustainability. The Allies were grinding forward with an industrial force that kept replenishing their ranks, weapons, and vehicles at a pace the Germans simply couldn't match. No matter how fast they moved, the Americans would always be just one step ahead. Weber stood, stretching his stiff legs as he walked to the window. Beyond the cracked glass, he could see the columns of American trucks, tankers, and supply vehicles streaming across the landscape. They were everywhere on every road, through every field, moving in a perfect, synchronized convoy. There was no break in the flow. No pause in the supply chain. It was endless. And it was suffocating the German forces. The roar of a passing American tank, its engine loud even from a distance, reminded Weber of how outmatched they were. The Americans were not just fighting with more men, they were fighting with more everything. More ammunition, more trucks, more tanks, more planes. The Germans had run out of ways to intercept it all. They had become trapped by their own inability to compete with the scale of the American war effort. We've lost the logistical war, Weber muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room. Sir, Schwartz said, his voice uncertain, is there nothing we can do? Can't we just destroy the supply lines? We have to hit them where it hurts. Weber turned to face him, his expression cold. We've tried, he said firmly. Every time we strike at their supply depots, they move them. Every time we hit their trucks, more trucks come. Their air superiority and their mobility are suffocating us. We can't match their scale. But sir, we have the advantage in tactics, Schwartz protested, though his voice lacked conviction. If we can just hit them from behind. Weber shook his head, cutting him off. No, Schwartz. It's not about tactics anymore. It's about resources. And they have all of them. The realization hit hard, like a cold slap. The Allies were no longer relying on bold tactics or desperate maneuvers. They were relying on something far more insidious, logistics. The backbone of the American military effort wasn't in the tanks or the men, it was in the seamless flow of supplies that kept every machine and soldier on the battlefield operational. The Germans had never faced anything like it. The scale of the American industrial effort, coupled with the Allies' ability to rapidly adapt, had left them scrambling. In the previous days, Weber had heard reports of German soldiers encountering American supply depots in the fields. Some of these depots were nothing more than piles of equipment and munitions, with no immediate defensive presence. German troops, eager to disrupt the supply flow, had attempted to attack these depots only to discover that they were already resupplied by the time the Germans arrived. The Americans had anticipated every move. They don't even need to win on the battlefield anymore, Weber said, almost to himself, "They're winning because they don't stop." The true horror of the situation was now fully apparent. The Germans could no longer depend on their strategic superiority. They had no secret weapon to counteract the American logistical machine. The war wasn't being decided on the battlefield, it was being decided in factories, supply depots, and shipping docks across the world. And the Germans were losing. June 10, 1944. 2 a.m. German frontline, Normandy. The sky above Normandy was thick with smoke, the stench of burning fuel and gunpowder heavy in the air. The sharp crack of machine gun fire echoed across the landscape, underscored by the deep thrum of American artillery. It was a long, grim night for the German forces. They were outnumbered, exhausted, and, worst of all, outlasted. Weber stood at the edge of a shallow trench, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The American forces had been relentless, their constant push from the beachheads never faltering. Behind him, a few tired soldiers huddled around a small fire, trying to find warmth against the wet, bone-chilling cold of the night. The rain had stopped, but the mud had taken its place, sticking to boots and uniforms like a heavy weight that couldn't be shaken. "Another push is coming," Lieutenant Schwartz said grimly, peering through his binoculars. "The Americans, they've been consolidating their positions all day. Now, they're preparing to move forward again. And I don't think they're stopping this time." Weber felt the weight of his own exhaustion pressing on him as he turned to face his subordinate. "How long can we hold?" Schwartz gave a sharp, defeated laugh. "Not long, sir. Not long at all." The two men didn't need to say more. The answer was obvious. No matter how many soldiers the Germans threw into the fray, it would never be enough to stop the Americans now. The supply lines, the ones that had once seemed like a manageable problem, had turned into an insurmountable wall. The American logistical power had suffocated any hope of a German victory. But even in the face of their certain defeat, there was a stubborn sense of pride that held the German soldiers together, a desire to fight until the very end. Weber watched as a few of his men prepared their weapons, checking the sights on their rifles, sharpening their bayonets. They weren't giving up, not yet. But Weber knew the truth. This battle wasn't about their bravery, or their tactics, or even their will to fight. It was about resources, and the Germans had none left. A burst of gunfire rang out in the distance, followed by a loud explosion as an American shell slammed into a nearby building, reducing it to rubble. Weber winced, the sound of war so familiar now that it barely registered as it once had. But in that moment, something inside him shifted. He had seen enough. He had heard enough. The realization that had been creeping in for days was now impossible to ignore. The Germans were simply not prepared for this kind of warfare. Their efficiency in battle, their discipline, their tactical flexibility, all of it had been rendered useless by the Americans' sheer industrial power. The scale of the resupply effort was beyond anything they had experienced. Even as they engaged the Americans in fierce firefights, the Allied supply lines never seemed to dry up. Fresh vehicles, tanks, and ammunition poured in constantly, never slowing, never halting. The Germans had nothing to match it. "We've been defeated," Weber said quietly, almost to himself. His voice was filled with a sorrow he hadn't expected to feel. It wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a defeat of an entire system. The Germans had once believed in their ability to wage a war of speed and precision. But speed had no meaning in the face of limitless supply, and precision was irrelevant when you were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. "We need to pull back," Weber said, turning to Schwartz with a hard look in his eyes. "Tell the men. We can't win this fight." Lieutenant Schwartz hesitated, the weight of those words settling heavily on him. "Sir, are you sure? We can't just leave." "We don't have a choice," Weber replied, his voice firm. "We'll be surrounded, we'll be annihilated if we stay here. It's over." The lieutenant nodded slowly, the realization sinking in. The battle for Normandy had already been lost. The Allies weren't just winning, they were reshaping the very nature of warfare. In this fight, the Germans had been outclassed not by superior tactics, but by an enemy whose ability to sustain a battle through logistics had completely outpaced them. In the hours that followed, the order to retreat was given. The German forces, beaten and demoralized, pulled back from their positions, abandoning the beaches and the land they had fought so hard to defend. They left behind the wreckage of tanks, trucks, and equipment, casualties of a war that had been won not by firepower, but by supply lines that stretched across the globe. As Weber watched his men retreat, he couldn't help but feel the bitter sting of defeat. It wasn't just the loss of the battle, it was the realization that the war, as they had understood it, had changed forever. The Germans had fought for years on the eastern and western fronts, relying on tactical ingenuity and superior strategy. But in Normandy, they had faced an enemy with a different kind of advantage. The Allies' ability to sustain their effort, to outlast the Germans at every turn, had broken their resolve. And as Weber looked out across the battlefield one last time, he knew that the battle for Normandy wasn't just the beginning of the end, it was a symbol of how the Allies had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare, transforming it into a contest of endurance, resources, and industrial might. The Germans would never be able to keep up.